We're out, but we're grateful that you're here, and I know all of us are grateful for the good weather we're enjoying here for a few days, and able to be thankful to God for that. But we are going to be tonight continuing in the book of Ecclesiastes, so if you have your Bible handy, you'll want to be turning there. And we're going to try to get through chapter 7 tonight, or part of chapter 7, I guess I should say, excuse me. But we're going to first begin by talking a little bit about chapter 6, because I wasn't exactly sure how far Freddie got, and last week, unfortunately, on the audio side of the streaming, the audio was not working, and several who were watching on Facebook had commented and said, can't hear anything, so the microphone may have been working in here, but it wasn't working through the live stream, so I couldn't tell what all Freddie was saying or how far he got exactly. So we're going to not worry too much about that, but we are going to try to just touch on chapter 6, because I don't know if he'd gotten that far. And really, it's one of the shorter chapters of the book, and so it won't take us very long just to mention a point or two from it. In fact, Ecclesiastes chapter 6 can really be summed up by saying that satisfaction can be elusive. I think most of us don't have to it's not something new to us. We certainly understand that principle and the way that things work. But he makes the point that God can give you everything you want. You can have health and wealth and possessions and honor, but there is something that God may not give you, and you may not have the power to enjoy those things. And so we often think that if we had the ability, if we had just, whatever we wanted, then we would be content and we would be satisfied. But that's certainly not the case. And again, as I mentioned some of these lessons, these points that we're drawing out from the book of Ecclesiastes in particular, I'm looking at a room mainly of older adults who have lived, quite many years and have already learned some of those lessons. You all are kind of familiar with that. It's something sometimes that we may look at children in particular and say, they really struggle. They struggle with satisfaction. They struggle with wanting or just being content with what they have and not wanting more and more as they go through that. But chapter 6 and verse number 2 points out, a man to whom God has given riches and wealth and honor, so that he lacks nothing for himself of all he desires, yet God does not give him power to eat of it, but a foreigner consumes it. This is vanity, and it is an evil affliction. We know that it's sometimes the case that people work so hard for things, and then they die, and it's going to go to someone else where they even can enjoy all of it. In fact, I'll just mention again, but we talked about this the very first quarter of the year as we touched on the idea of our stewardship of our things, and Kyle Butt and the series that we looked at was great. But towards the end, if not the last week, maybe the week before, we began to touch on this idea of how we should handle final things, how we should handle what we leave behind. Should we leave any of it to the church? It may not always be the case. A lot of times we're more concerned about our family and children and grandchildren, and there's a sense in which that's perfectly reasonable and fine. Unfortunately, some people either don't make plans and then all their stuff goes to their kids or grandkids or whomever like that, and often maybe those people are not good Christian people. They're not God-fearing people. They're sort of living for themselves. And so then where does all that stuff go? Maybe a person's not made any plans, or maybe they've kind of made those normal plans like a lot of us do, leaving it to our direct descendants. Again, nothing sinful about that. You've worked hard for it. Your family, you want to be able to take care of them. But sometimes it might be something worth considering. What can we do with what we leave behind to continue to serve God, as opposed to just wasting it or having it, go to nothing because of maybe who it ends up with. And so this idea here that certainly, and not even considering those things, but just in general, sometimes we work so hard to achieve things, and whether it's the time of life, as in it takes us some time, takes us a long time before we build up enough wealth to enjoy some of those things, and then, maybe our life ends a little earlier than expected. Maybe that's 60 or 70 or I don't know, but you get you think, well, I've got 10, 15, 20 more years to live and enjoy these things, but yet that's not, in fact, what's going to happen. And of course, the truth is that God has made our appetite in a way that it can't be satisfied. Look at chapter 6 and verse 7. Chapter 6 and verse 7. All the labor of man is for his mouth, and yet the soul is not satisfied. God makes our lives this way if we would just pay attention to it. Think about a meal. You don't eat on Sunday, the first day of the week, and then you're good for the week. No, you're hungry again, right? You're not satisfied. You're not even satisfied for the rest of the day, right? You know, my kids are already asking what's for supper by 3 o'clock in the afternoon sometimes, you know. You're not even satisfied for the day. You're going to need another meal. And, of course, maybe that's kind of what God is teaching us about some of these things. You know, a few weeks ago, we quoted the great poet Billy Joel, right? Some of you know the great poet Mick Jagger. That might be the only thing great about him. I don't know. But I can't get no satisfaction, right? Maybe there, folks even of the world sometimes are on this idea. And even that song there by Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones said, and I try, and I try, and I try, and I try. And I know that song's about a lot of other things, but it's just interesting to consider that a lot of people understand that it's hard to get that satisfaction, especially when we're trusting in earthly things or we're trying to be content in those things. We'll have more on that in just a moment as we get to chapter 7. But what comments or questions there?
That would look like to be something foolish.
Yeah.
At the same time, that point certainly is applicable.
We talk about doing, the best we can, making the best choices in life, and that's certainly another one that we have an opportunity to consider. Again, if you've worked hard and worked your life for the money that you have and the retirement you set aside, those things, and certainly you're free to do with it, but it is something that we probably should consider because we can have an impact even after we're gone, and even continuing these thoughts of realizing that it doesn't have to be meaningless. We're going to get to that in a moment. It doesn't have to be vanity, but it's not that way when we're using it for God's glory or using it as God would have us to do. Then we can kind of keep it going in a sense. So, anything else here from chapter 6? Again, I know it's a very quick look at it, and I think we're pretty much on schedule as far as looking at the last few chapters. The material that I've been using, I want to make mention of this again. You can see on the right-hand side there, even if you can't quite make it out. But some of the material I've been using and giving to Freddie even to use while I've been gone is from the West Palm Beach Church of Christ down in Florida, and Brother Brent Kirchville that puts a lot of this together. It's on their website. I say that because I always try to share good resources with you. And if you ever go to their website, they've got a search engine on there or a page where you can search. And he has tried, from my understanding, to cover entire books through the years, maybe in a year's time, or maybe even a little longer than that if necessary. But you can go and search, and you'll find an entire series. And what I find interesting is it never really breaks down nice and neat, as in quarterly. For instance, for the Ecclesiastes, there's 16 lessons. And not 13, which would make a quarter kind of thing. And maybe that's because he just broke it down the way he saw fit, and it's the best for him and the way he feels that the text should be broken down. But you can find good material on almost every book of the Bible, and so that's what I've been using. And so I borrowed their picture there on the left-hand side. But if you're open up to the book still, we're going to look at chapter 7, which he calls the School of Life. And again, I know it's kind of hard for you to make out from your seat because it's kind of hard for me to make out on that TV back there from here. But it says on the back of the bus sign there, "Don't waste your life" series. And that's what this is. We've talked about that the kind of the main theme through this is don't waste your life. And so as we come to Ecclesiastes chapter 7, the teacher is going to tell us that there are things that are better in life. We talked about this word vanity at the very beginning. Vanity of vanity. All is vanity. And we've used this word meaningless. And so some people look at the book and they say, well, what's the point? Why am I wasting my time, living a righteous life? Because everything is meaningless. And so I just need to do what I want to do. I should just live how I want to live. And so the question keeps coming up, and I think I have it at the end again if we make it all the way to the last slide I have. But what do we get for all that we put into this life? That's the question. What do we get for that? What is the advantage or benefit that we have? And so we've tried to note here that everything is not meaningless. There are some things that are better. There are some things that are important things to think about in life. There are some things that are better than other things. And so for this particular chapter, Brother Kirchville in his notes breaks it down into the school of life and allowing the school of life to teach us things that are better things so that we don't waste our life. A lesson that a lot of young people need to learn, and maybe we needed to learn it when we were younger, and maybe we can still apply some of these things. And so there's about 5 or 6 things that are at the front here, or points that we're going to bring out, and then we'll kind of sum it up at the end. But number 1, a good name is better. 5 or 6 things here that are better. Number 1, a good name. Verse 1, and not even all of verse 1, right? Just part A of verse 1. A good name is better than precious ointment. And so the school of life, as we're calling it tonight, opens up by talking about this idea that a good name is worth more than expensive perfume. And so as we think about the futility of life and the futility of things, of our efforts, we give so much of our time and effort for things in this world that do not matter and do not provide us a benefit. But now the teacher kind of doubles back, if you will, and he wants us to think about this from another perspective. And so, a question here, and I got a few more I'll ask. I didn't put them all on the screen. But what does it matter? We're talking about things that are better. What does it matter if you work and get what you are working for, but no one likes you? I mean, right? You're not a person anyone wants to be around. What does it matter if you increase your wealth? I mean, just even think about the town of Dunlap, the Sequatchie Valley here. What if you increase your wealth and you happen to be the richest person in this city or in this county? What does it matter if you increase your wealth, but no one has good things to say about you? What is the point if you are a success, but no one wants to be around you? We need to think about our reputation. And in fact, as again, I just keep coming across this fact that so much of this is what we strive excuse me, to pound into our young people, right? I mean, maybe when they're in kindergarten, it kind of starts, but they get to middle school and they're making a few more decisions, and they get to high school, they're going on their own to college, and we're just time and time again, we're encouraging them to think about their reputation. The fact that it takes a long time to build a good reputation, and it takes what? Moments sometimes to lose that reputation. I used the illustration the other night in a sermon, and I picked on Tony. Some of you were here, may not have been here, but I was picking on Tony about this idea of being blameless, and that kind of mentioned as far as our elders go. But that if someone came to me, it was the lesson kind of on conflict resolution, and said, well, I saw Tony out drinking, and I would say, the point of the lesson, of course, was, I would say, well, I don't think that's true. Give him the benefit of the doubt, trying to get more into it. But I made the point, maybe Tony was, maybe he'd had a bad day, or he and Trish had a big fight, and something happens, and he makes a mistake. What would that do to his reputation? Kind of taking that illustration and that lesson and pivoting just a little bit. But it's possible for us, to spend our lives building up this good reputation, and then in a sense like that, just to turn around and one night, one poor decision, it's gone. So many people have learned that lesson the hard way. Another question here, it's not on the screen, but what do people think about when they hear your name? Well, it's real easy to say, well, I don't know. Nobody tells me. I don't know. But a lot of times we know someone's reputation. Do they think about godliness, generosity, love, kindness, gentleness? Everything that we do each day is building that reputation. And not only for ourselves and for our family, for our children or grandchildren, for our spouse, but you just think about the church at Dunlap, bearing the name Christian. We need to make decisions that build a good reputation, because the point here, while we understand, but it's worth more than expensive perfume. A good name is better than wealth. A good name is priceless, is what the teacher here is trying to point out. So, number 1, a good name is better. I'm going to try to get through 2 and 3 here, and then I'll try to pause and we'll take some comments. Number 2, death is better than birth, right? I ask you to stop at part A of verse 1. You keep reading, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. Now, we're going to come back and talk about verse 2 in just a moment, because they kind of connect, but they're separated for this purpose. And the truth is, when we think about this one, we don't like it. Right? We kind of frown at this one. Nobody wants to think that this is true. But if you have your Bibles open still there, look back in chapter 4 and verses 1 and 2, and it's a recurring theme. The writer has already said this. In verses 1 and 2, he talks about this. Verse 2, therefore I praise the dead who are already dead more than the living who are still alive. Thinking about this idea of maybe it's better to have not even been born than to go through all the suffering and injustice that exists in the world. But our problem here, we might say, is that our thinking is a little backward. It's a little backwards when we talk about it in this way, because often we have I don't know if it's wrong concept, a wrong idea, some backward thinking when it comes to death. We think of death as a bad thing. Is it a bad thing? Well, for those who are left behind, it's most certainly a bad thing. When we think about that, I mention this sometimes at funerals that I have a part in or whatever, but when we lose a loved one, there is a quite literally a hole in our lives, our family's life, and there's quite literally this space that's now void for at least a time that we are upset about, that we are sad about. And so, yes, in that way, we think of death as a bad thing. We think that death is supposed to be avoided at all costs. I wish I had taken the time. I hadn't really thought about it until just this moment, but I probably could have done the research and looked up how much money is spent every year, right, around the world, right, or in our country. How much money is spent on not necessarily even just life-saving things. I'm not talking about like doctors and life-saving equipment in the hospital. I'm talking about buying the right kind of food or the wrong kind of food, or the right kind of this or the wrong kind of, or doing this or taking this or doing that. Probably a lot of money is spent each year on people trying to avoid death. But as people of faith, maybe we think about it backwards just a little bit. I'm not suggesting that we should all go play in the road together, right? That we just try to bring it on and invite it, drive as fast as we can, or, just throw caution to the wind and going to eat whatever I want, those kinds of things. Who really cares? It's not that. But Paul does say in Philippians 1 and verse 21, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. To die is gain. Is dying better than living? So again, the question, is it possible that we think of death as a bad thing, that it's supposed to be avoided at all costs, that we need to try to live as long as we possibly can and avoid death as long as we possibly can? Is that the ultimate goal? Again, I don't want anybody in my family to be gone. I don't want to be gone. I hope you understand the conundrum that it kind of sounds like that we're in sometimes. One more real quick here, 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 4. Paul says, for while we are still in this tent, right, this struggle, he talks a lot in Philippians as well about this kind of wrestling back and forth between the body, the tent, the tabernacle that we're in, and longing to be with the Lord. For we are still in this tent. While we are still in this tent, we groan, being burdened. Not that we would be unclothed, but that we would be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. Paul tells us that the mortal is not being swallowed up by death. These mortal bodies are being swallowed up by life, because in a sense, life begins when this body dies. Death is the end of the futility of these things. Death is the end of suffering, pain, and frustration. I get it. I'm not suggesting that I want anybody in this room or anybody I love to be gone sooner than we expect. But sometimes it's worth the gut check, the self-check, to say, well, but is that what I'm putting all my effort towards? Simply trying to remain here. As people of faith, we should see death as gain, not as loss. In a sense, death is sort of the point of life. It's not an evil outcome. So often, even here recently, seeing some folks that have left this world and the rejoicing that goes on even amongst so much sadness and difficulty for those left behind. And it's kind of hard, but life is frail. You know, these bodies are broken bodies, and death is the gain for what comes after. And again, that can be very difficult to wrestle with, but, you know, I think we understand what he's saying here. We'll stop here for just a moment. What comments or questions about either a good name is better or death is better than birth? Verse 1 here.
I think anybody that knows what Scripture says about the matter and the observations that we make in life, the older that you get, the more you realize that is how that you don't want to be hoping to leave it to somebody else to have to deal with it, but at the same time, it is an escape from the sorriness that exists in the world where you don't have to worry about it anymore. A part of the, we always hold up there in Revelation chapter 20, no tears, no sadness, no pain, all that. No junk, no what is on the, no school shootings, no murder, no, I mean, all that too. And so to long for the peace and the rest for your labor, Revelation 14:13, that is an attractive thing. That's not like you want to sissy out, and quit before your time or whatever. But like you said, it should not be looked upon as something you want to avoid at all costs. And of course, again, we think about the massive amount of misinformation that we've been fed down through the years to maintain our lives old, so we get older and older and older and older. And yet we see somebody that's done all that and got older and older and older, and they're miserable.
Yeah.
If they hadn't took such good care of themselves, they could have died earlier and felt a whole lot better.
Any other comments, questions here? Yeah, Charlie.
From the time we're born, we start to die. People just overlook that part.
Yeah.
But to die in Christ, you should not have any fear.
Yeah.
And people that are out of Christ, they should fear.
Yeah.
Because they have a judgment coming to them like we have a judgment coming to us. But preparation through life is the most important thing. And knowing that our soul is the most important thing. Therefore, physical death should not be a big deal.
Sure. I don't want to. I kind of want to pause here in just a second and move on for the sake of time, because certainly it's kind of one of those, another lesson for another time. But I think I was listening to someone recently or reading something, or where someone talked about the fact that death brings an unknown. We don't know. We can read what Scripture tells us about what might occur, what's occurring, but it's an unknown, and that makes us nervous. So you add that on top of the joy that we can feel here amongst family and friends. And I understand. I mean, it's natural to say, well, but I was thinking about Philippians 1 there. Later in that passage in verse 23, Paul says, "For I am hard pressed between the two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better for him. Nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is more needful for you." And that idea of hard pressed, really wrestling with that sometimes in this life is a part of this. Real quick here, number 3 is connected with number 2 in that verses 2 through 7 go on to talk about this fact that grief is better than laughter. The writer says, in a sense, that funerals are better than weddings. Now, this is not a play on the fact that Freddie always refers to weddings as funerals. That's just because Freddie's got a little mean streak in him and always says you're going to a funeral when he means a wedding. But that's not what this is. But it says, quite there, literally in verse 2, better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. And so, again, we kind of look at these things. He also says in verse 3 there, back in chapter 7 of Ecclesiastes, that grief is better than laughter. Verse 4, that the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of pleasure. So why is the house of mourning better than the house of gladness and pleasure? And in verse 2 and in verse 5, the writer tells us that the key here is that the house of mourning causes us to be more reflective. As I have here on the screen, another way to say that is we don't listen. We don't listen when we're in times of laughter. When things are good, when things are great, we tend to think we've got it all figured out. We don't listen in the good times, and we think that we don't need anyone else. We're told that the house of mourning means we start thinking about our lives. We start thinking about how the funeral is the outcome for every person. We often learn, we often listen when we are in times of grief, but we do not listen when we are full of laughter. Constant laughter teaches us nothing. And again, the problem here is that we often live our lives trying to avoid all the grief and all the sadness and just have lives of joy and laughter. And we don't, back to what I've said already several times, don't wish that anyone would die. I don't mean that in any way. But we often find that that's when we do experience some learning times, that we think about the reality of life and we reflect upon the house of mourning. Listen to what the psalmist says, Psalm 90 and verse 12. Psalm 90 and verse 12. So teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. What does he say there? Numbering our days is the path to the heart of wisdom. Constant laughter is not wisdom. And I say that as someone who loves to laugh. I love to laugh. I say it all the time, be here after services, sitting up here with the other adults and young families and those who are staying around, and we're laughing and we're having a good time. I love it. But I also know that sometimes we need to learn from tragedy. We need to learn from the difficulty. So once again, as parents with our children, we sometimes want them to avoid all the bad things in life. We don't want those things to happen. We don't want them to suffer. We want them to have it better than we had it. In some ways, those sentiments are not wrong, but we know when they go through something that breaks their heart, that causes them tears, something that they have to go through, but we are there to walk with them through that and help them. Hopefully they come out on the other side a better person. They've learned a lesson from grief, even if it's not maybe the same kind of grief as thinking about this here. Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse number 5, we need to listen to the rebuke rather than just listening to the praise of fools. The New King James says, the song of fools. When we think about these people who do seem to have it all figured out, they do seem to have all the money and the happiness in the world, they're often surrounded by yes men, by fools who will just keep singing this song of you're great, you're wonderful. As long as I'm attached to you, then I can have what I need. You'll take care of all my needs because you're making enough money for that to be so. And so we need to think about that. Grief can be better than laughter. It's not funner, right? It's not more enjoyable. But as we think about life and what we get out of this life, then this is something we need to consider. All right, number four, patience is better. Verses 8 and 9. Patience is better than pride. Don't let your spirit rush to anger, because notice what it says there. I like this in verse 9. The New King James says, do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. I can't remember what version this is exactly here, maybe the English Standard Version, but anger lodges in the heart of fools. You know, I mean, that's what we think about when we think about those who are foolish. It dwells in their lap. And the thing about this that we want to notice is anger is a waste of our lives. You know, when we think about being angry, some folks who spend their life always upset about something, it's not fun. I mean, it's sort of a waste of time when we think about that. Anger shows our pride because anger is selfish. Anger shows I'm thinking about me. Anger does not think about others. Anger thinks only about self. And so we realize that it's a waste of our lives. And here's the point. You have a choice. You have a choice. Why are you allowing yourself to get angry? This is the good news. Actually, you have power over your anger. You can control your anger. Patience is wisdom. Patience is humility. Notice the contrast there again in verse 8. The end of a thing is better than its beginning. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit.
You know, it's sort of, I don't think I've seen this ever before, probably there, but I've seen where you got the contrast between patience
Yeah. Who often is our anger, often it's angering ourselves, right? I mean, no, not always bothering someone else. It's our problem. Hannah, what's that movie we always talk about? Just anger management? Yeah. Anger management, which I don't even know if I've ever seen all of it, so I'm not recommending it. Probably not a great movie to watch. But the concept is one we understand where someone is just always told they're angry. And they eventually get mad. I'm not angry. You just keep telling me I'm angry. I'm not really the one who's angry. And so nowadays they call it, I say all the time, what's it called? Gaslighting. Sorry. When you gaslight somebody. That's kind of the idea behind that, where it's like somebody says, well, you must feel this way. You're like, well, no, I don't. And then they say, well, wait a minute, you're yelling at me. You must be angry. No, you're upsetting me. But you think about it that way. Oftentimes, our anger just affects us. Other people are walking around and say, what's your problem? What's going on? I mean, and so it builds up within us. And back to the middle point there, it's a waste of our lives. We can spend our days being angry about every little thing. And back to the social media presence that we always talk about, you can find, anything to be angry about. Just peruse the news for a while, peruse social media, and there's always something that someone is upset about. And there are some things that are worth it and worth our time and effort that we need to be upset about and maybe take a stand for truth or for what's right. And then other times we just simply spend our lives being angry instead of having patience. And of course, ending our anger requires ending our pride, ending our selfishness when it comes to a lot of these things and thinking about them. So very quickly here, number 5, the present is better. 2 more here. The present is better. Next, in verse 10, the teacher tells us not to think that the past is better than the present. Do not be tricked by nostalgia. Freddie says the good old days. Do not say, this is Brother Kirchville in his notes, do not say, why were the old days better than these? Just to read a little bit more of his words here, do not fool yourself about the past. It is not what you are making it to be in your mind. And then I picked this phrase here, don't be tricked by nostalgia. It's real easy, and I'm sure it's been real easy for every successive generation, all right, to look back and say, that generation that's coming up is ruining things, and it was so much better when we were younger and we were in charge, or so much better, so much different. I know we can look back at a time, I don't know if I preached about this, we've talked about it in class, but I know we can look back at a time when our country was more God-focused and God-centered. But we can't point to the 1990s or the early 2000s or 2010s and say that homosexuality just sprung up out of nowhere, right? Because we have it in front of us in these little things that we're carrying around and opening up tonight. Now, maybe it's more in our faces, maybe the way that we consume it or that people talk about it and that kind of thing is different. Maybe it's pushed a little bit more than it once was, but it's real easy to be tricked by nostalgia to say that the past was so much better than the present. But notice what he says here in verse 10. Do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. We have an amazing way, and again, I think all of us do, each generation, we have an amazing way of remembering the past in a completely positive light. Forgetting the problems that were around us, the difficulties that we went through this. He says here in his notes, I have a way to prove this to our hearts. How many times have you gone back to a place that you fondly remember only to see that it is not how you remember it at all? What you thought was so amazing was actually just maybe an amazing memory. Your mind possibly edited out all the harsh parts, and all you remember are positive things, which was not the reality. So the teacher says here to not fool yourself about the past. The past is not always better. Do not spend your time, we're talking about wasting your life, do not spend your time just simply wishing for those days to be so. And each generation has its challenges. Again, maybe things are pushed in our country in a way that they weren't years ago. But when we think about the present and we think about the past, we've got to be careful that we're not tricked by nostalgia.
Of course, when I was younger, I used to hear presidents say, back there in He said, don't think it ever, there's a period of time where everybody had it all together and knew the truth, upside down. No, that's never been the way it is. Wasn't that way in the first century when you got inspired men? So it's easy to think back, oh yeah, back there they were just geniuses and smart and nobody did dumb stuff. That's wrong. That's just not so.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning that. I think that's a really good point. That's this kind of idea exactly. And I would say here real quickly that what each one of us has a responsibility to, including the elders and maybe the preacher, all of us together, is to look at the situation we're in and do the best we can with what we have. For instance, I can stand up here and I talk about Hannah and I a lot, but we feel like, I mean, we're not exactly the sandwich generation in a sense, but we feel sandwiched a little bit between what we would call the non-technology times and the technology times, right? There's a whole book I have in my library that calls us digital immigrants. And of course, a lot of us in this room fit into that. We remember a time when there wasn't a computer in every room or in your room. The internet couldn't just be pulled up. We weren't all carrying it around with us. Certainly, we're immigrants to this day and time. Our kids surrounding us here are digital natives. They don't know a time where somebody didn't have one of these things in their hand. Now, that's not all bad, but it is what it is. It's kind of just the fact of it. We can sit here, and I do it because I feel like we're in the middle of it. I can sit here just like you and say, man, social media is awful. It's the worst thing in the world. I can't believe all that our kids have to deal with. And trust me, there's a lot of bad. I got another book I've not even finished yet, but I'll let you have it if you want to look through it. There's a lot of bad out there. But I just wonder sometimes what the Apostle Paul might say if he didn't have to spend 8 hours a day on the road to go somewhere else in order to preach to another city. And he said, well, you mean to tell me I could just sit here and compose a sermon and then I can share that, or I can video a sermon and I can share that and it can go around to other people? I mean, that sounds great to me. Now, it's not perfect and you got to take the good and the bad. I'm just simply suggesting maybe we would all be wiser, which is fixing to be our next point. Wisdom is better. We would all be wiser to say technology is not all bad. The non-technology was not all good. It is what it is. What are we going to do with it? How are we going to handle it? Because let me tell you again, that the book I'm talking about, and just go on the news today, our kids need help. Young people need help. Adults need help with these things. You start talking about mental health and the depression and these things, reading something the other day about kids and, cyberbullying, all this stuff, they need help. There's a lot of bad out there. We also can do some good with it, but it is what it is, and we've got to be wise, which very quickly here, we've got just a few minutes left. Wisdom is better. Verses 11 through 13. The teacher wants us to appreciate the importance of wisdom. Wisdom is like an inheritance. It benefits you for your life. It can be a shelter and protection from life's troubles. Now, unfortunately, often the way that we get wisdom is a phrase that all of you know, and we call it the school of hard knocks, right? That's how you get wisdom sometimes, is you got to go through the bad things. You got to struggle with that, and then you gain wisdom. But if we strive to gain God's wisdom, then it can be a shelter. If we could get our kids to apply some of these lessons when they're younger, maybe they don't make the same mistakes. They're protected from some of that. But here is a key piece. Look at verse 13. Consider the work of God, who can make straight what he has made crooked. And so we start with this truth that we actually talked about back in Ecclesiastes chapter 1. This was one of our titles, I think, maybe in the second week, that life is crooked. Life is crooked. And now the teacher says it again. No one can straighten what God has made crooked. And in a sense, this is the essence of the curse, right? The curse going all the way back to Genesis. That's the essence of the curse. This world is full of futility. The ways of this world, all it does is produce futility and emptiness. Back to what we were talking about a moment ago with our kids, our young people. So many of them are chasing money and influence and all those things. And Freddie's already talked about tonight. It just brings emptiness. The world produces that futility, and there is nothing we can do to change this. So the message is, don't waste your life. Seek to have a better life, but the better life will not come from the worldly ways. Wisdom is better. God's wisdom is better. Since God made the world crooked, or it was made crooked certainly through the entrance of sin into it, and creation is subject to futility, then we've got to enter this school of life, hopefully avoid some of the school of hard knocks, and understand some of these things. Listen to what the teacher has to say. As much as you feel like you're blue in the face saying it to your kids and grandkids, the teacher's been saying it thousands of years ago. He was saying it when you were a young person, when I was a young person. Avoid these things. Don't waste your life. And so tonight, here, the school of life, and the grief ones are put together, so this is just 5. But the school of life says you need to put value on the things that matter. You need to put value on the things that are better and the things that can provide you what God would have you to live. Value having a good reputation. What does it matter if you've got stuff and no one wants to be around you? Value times of grief. Boy, that may be the hardest of all. Value times of grief as a time of reflection and learning. People of faith understand that death is the gain that all of life is pointing toward. Value patience. Do not let anger reside in your heart. Value the present. Do not think that the past was better. Value the wisdom of God so that you can enjoy and learn from every moment that God gives to you. Now, that was easy, right? It's easy for me to say. It's hard for all of us to do, myself included. None of us are perfect at knowing and understanding all these things just the right way. And we can all sit here tonight and say, amen, that sounds great, and then we struggle to apply it to our lives. But the teacher here is saying, I have been through it. In fact, we stopped there at verse 13, but verse 15 picks up there just as we think about moving kind of into next week. Verse 15, I have seen everything in my days of vanity. As we've pointed out multiple times already from this great book and these chapters, I would just say again here to conclude tonight, it reminds me that it's not that it's pointless, it's not that it's a waste of time, but that when we value the right things, then life has a meaning, it has purpose. That those who die and die in the Lord, while there is sadness in our lives, we learn something from that, and it helps us strive to be that way. And so may we take all this and seek to apply it, teach it to others, especially those of our own family that we love dearly. We want them to do the right thing, value the things that truly matter, and then, God will allow us, will help us enjoy life. That's what we said, I guess it may have been 2 weeks ago when I was last here and teaching the class, but 2 weeks ago that life is not meant to be insufferable. It's meant to be enjoyed, but it's the way that God has planned for us to. So that's chapter 7, verses 1 through 13. As I mentioned at the start, this material is put together in such a way that it doesn't always quite break down just nice and neat. So we will pick up in verse 14, whether it's the rest of the chapter or into chapter 8, I can't remember. But if you are enjoying this and want to read ahead a little bit, you can look certainly at the rest of 7 and chapter 8 and maybe have a bit of a mind about the material before we come in next week. But I appreciate your comments and your good attention tonight, and we'll pick up there.